Very much indeed, Mark. Thanks indeed for your comments there. I'm delighted also to welcome everyone to the Scottish Tourism Alliance Hustings, a great opportunity to have a bit of an insight into what the parties are saying about an industry that is absolutely gigantic in terms of the Scottish economy. Now, these are curious times, and therefore an extremely curious set of elections, and therefore a slightly different hustings. I usually prefer these events to be gladiatorial, if that is a possible description. But given the events that we have today, given the events surrounding us, it's going to be a little bit different today. Each of the leaders, each of the main figures, the chief figures from the five parties, will set out their position. I'll then ask some questions, a bit of cheek from me, a bit of insolence from me, but also questions that have been submitted by members of the STA. As Mark rightly mentioned, I would be delighted if we get some questions going as the event happens. If you think one of the speakers is havering, or you think one of the speakers has said some particularly pertinent point, that it would be great to have your comments, your questions. Please keep them succinct so that I can put them as swiftly as possible to the individuals, and we'll get a bit of discussion going there within that, and hopefully be able to illuminate the concerns, the anxieties of the sector with regard to these exceptionally difficult times. With all of that, I'm delighted to welcome the first of our speakers today from the SNP, Fergus Ewing, Cabinet Secretary, and I'll ask Fergus first of all to set out his opening position. Fergus, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Brian, and good morning, everybody. This has been the worst of years, and there's no question that tourism, aviation, hospitality and leisure have collectively been hit as hard as any sector in the economy over the past year and more. And it has been the most testing of times for people in tourism. There is no question about that. Over this past year, I've sought as the tourism minister to work hard with the STA, and I'd like to begin by praising the STA and its leadership, Mark and Stephen and their team, for providing powerful advocacy in a reasonable and effective way throughout. Your voice has been listened to. Over the past year, there have really been three priorities for me. Working with yourselves on a constant basis, frankly. One has been to provide a measure of financial support to alleviate the financial hardship that has resulted to an enormous extent across the whole sector. And that has been an all-encompassing and engulfing task, as I think many of you in this call will know. Second, my job has been within the Scottish Government to be an advocate in a persuasive fashion, I hope, to encourage my colleagues that lifting restrictions can be done and can safely be done, because safety is paramount, and the approach of the Scottish Government, quite rightly, has been one of caution. The last thing we want is to see, as we are seeing now in some mainland European countries, the advent of a further lockdown. And therefore, although some of the decisions have been difficult, hard-fought, controversial, contentious, at times there has been friction and disagreement, but nonetheless, we have still worked as a team over this past period, and we are now, as has been said, ready to see reopening starting off next week on a gradual time thereafter. I'm still advocating right now for lifting restrictions as soon as it's safe to do so. It's essential we see not just domestic, but international inbound travel restart. The third and final thing I would say, Brian, before passing to questions, is that I think we want to be positive too. We don't want to find ourselves in the slough of depression. Scotland is a tremendous place for people to enjoy a marvellous holiday of all sorts and varieties. At the weekend, I had the pleasure of a socially distanced coffee at the rear immaculate gardens at the King's Mills Hotel in Inverness. And when I went back home, I could see the Larry Grue covered in snow with a fine har nesting over the top of it. People come from all over the world to enjoy what we've got, and they will again very soon. So let's all be positive in promoting our ideas for recovery across the parties and work together to get tourism back and as successful as it was pre-COVID, and to achieve that just as soon as we possibly can. Thank you very much.
Fergus Ewing, thank you very much indeed, Fergus. Thanks for that. I loved your enthusiasm for the joys and delights of your own patch. It reminded me of the statement, what a lovely moon, and it's in the constituency too. You know, that was seriously, thanks for that. Let me pick you up on a point in your own policy statement about your own party's policy statement about tourism. You talk about a campaign to encourage people to support local tourism and hospitality in Scotland when it is safe to do so. Now, I understand your caution on that, but the industry has felt that there's been some dragging of heels, even perhaps behind the situation in England. The industry has been anxious. Could there be some further good news on the horizon, perhaps even a further liberalisation, maybe as soon as an announcement tomorrow or in the near future?
Well, I have taken the view that my job is to argue for a loosening of the restrictions as soon as it's safe to do so. I've been doing that really constantly. I'm aware that the STA has most recently expressed concerns about the capacity calculation method for hospitality settings. I'm aware of the concern of restriction of serving a bottle of wine with a meal. And let me say, take the King's Mills as an example. When I enjoyed a socially distanced coffee outside there, my partner, who's in the NHS, observed that the scrupulous rigor of application of cleansing is, if anything, above that which may apply in the NHS. So the sector has given confidence to people by taking so seriously its responsibilities to its customers and clientele. And that, I think, will bode well for Scotland with the vaccination success in comparison with other countries. In other words, we may...
Do you think the caution is necessary? Because some feel the caution was overcautious.
Well, indeed, it's a balance, Brian. We are learning as we go along. But we have been working very much as a team, the Scottish Government and the STA. That will continue. And I know that the First Minister, as we all do, wants to see resumption, both of domestic and in due course inbound. She therefore is absolutely aware of the strong views and has frequently met Mark and Stephen to discuss them.
Okay, let's pick up a question. It comes from David Lonsdale, Scottish Retail Consortium. Good question. What are your plans to reduce the cost of doing business for all firms involved in tourism, including in supply chains? A good point there, that it isn't just the primary providers of tourist facilities, it can be the supply chains as well.
Well, across the board, Brian, we have set out a rates relief package of 100% for this year. That's slightly more generous, I think, than down south. In addition to that, we have recognised in Scotland that the supply chain has been affected. For example, the tourism coach sector, for example, the wholesale sector, we did have bespoke funds in order to provide some assistance, albeit that I recognise that the level of support is less than some would wish. But we do recognise that without the supply chain, who will supply the food and the drink to bars and restaurants? Who will provide the transportation of cruise passengers to visitor attractions? So the point is extremely well made. And in recovery, we have to think about the whole sector and provide a reasonable level, Brian, of financial support to enable that recovery to happen and as quickly as possible, and to involve the enterprise agencies as well, who I think in the past could have been criticised as a bit standoffish from the tourism sector.
You mentioned non-domestic rates, the point being made there about the current year's support, but a question from Willie McLeod of UK Hospitality. He's looking beyond that. He's looking for the non-domestic rates issue in the sector 22-23 and beyond the 2023 revaluation. In other words, there's concern that it could take years for the sector to recover, and they want support over a longer term period.
Well, yes, and I do share these concerns, but we have a duty to boost Scotland as an international market globally, and we also have a duty to stimulate the market domestically, and we have plans in our manifesto to do, Brian, both of these things and provide specific financial support. But I do think Willie's point is that in the past, tourism has been the cash cow. Business rates, VAT, corporation tax, income tax, payroll tax, a whole plethora of taxes, I think in future we need to recognise that these level of tax pre-COVID just won't work. And I do work well with Nigel Huddleston, the UK minister, who I think is of the same view. So I think collectively, I would like to see a lesser tax burden and an extension of the VAT relief by the UK government. And to be fair, they have listened to some extent in that regard, as well as on the furlough. But the longer COVID restrictions go on, the more difficult it actually becomes, particularly for large employers, such as hotels, for example. And therefore, we have sought to provide in our hotel fund, again, something not found down south, additional support to try to help the task of retention of employment in the sector.
Let me pick you up on a couple of points you actually made that are picked up in questions, and I'm just getting in now in the chat room, and thanks for those, they're superb. Stephen Montgomery talking about the business of the difference between, you know, serving alcohol and serving a meal. Audrey, I think from Pinsent Mason, saying, what is it? She's picking up your phrase. What is the difference between a socially distanced coffee and a socially distanced beer or glass of wine?
Well, the difference is very simple, Brian, and that is that, as I think both of us know, as one becomes more lubricated, the propensity is to become less inhibited, and therefore perhaps not so mindful of the socially distancing rules. I think that's the fundamental element. But I would say in defense of the sector that I think there's a very strong case that bars, restaurants and hotels have a very well managed structure where their guests are in a managed environment, as opposed to, for example, illicit house parties where management there is none.
Yeah, I've got a question from Stuart as well. You mentioned international tourism. He says, those of us who rely on international tourism, for those of us, there is a cloud of depression. He says, we need to get the doors open. We need to use vaccination plans. They want firm plans in place to accept international visitors. He says, the clients ready and willing to travel, especially from North America. What about that international incoming tourism?
Well, obviously, we want to see international inbounds, which is absolutely crucial. We cannot have our tourism sector without the international visitors for a whole number of reasons. The timing of that is challenging because of, as we know, Brian, the worrying resurgence of the virus in various parts and countries of the world. And therefore, in all parts of the UK, this is a serious challenge. But I very much hope that as the success of the vaccination takes place, both here and in other countries abroad, we will see a system for resumption of international inbound as quickly as possible. That is our view, and working as far as possible on a four nations approach.
Frank Whitaker question as well. I'll sum it up a little bit, but the point being that businesses maybe are not able to wait. The difficulty in catching up with the problems that they're facing. Comparable question from Elaine Green, Edinburgh Capital Group. How would your party support the tourism sector in cities to recover and thrive, to deliver sustainable and responsible experiences for visitors and residents? The idea being they're going to need support for a period. There's a period ahead in which it's going to be really, really tough. Minister Fergus Ewing.
Yes, I do think that continued support will be required, and part of my job has been to argue for that with some success, but there's much more to be done. I want to see the revival of our conference sector, our wedding sector, the revival of international inbound and aviation, which is so important to our capital city and elsewhere. And therefore, I do think that in principle, Brian, more financial support will be required for a longer period. Even after the restrictions have been lifted, the effects of COVID will continue and I'm afraid linger, especially in some sectors. So I think it is taken as read that this is the case, and it's part of my job to argue that case if I am re-elected and reappointed.
How do you feel, how long could it take for the tourism sector to see, Elaine Green's question is talking about thriving. How long could it be before we think they are surviving? Because, you know, the point being that incoming business tourism, for example, generated $2 billion for each year, and that needs inbound travel. How long do we have to wait before you think it gets back to something approaching normality, Minister?
Well, I think that to begin, starting from next Monday, we will see small accommodation providers, self-catering, caravans, B&Bs, guest houses, and also hotels start to recover. I think the domestic sector is therefore, as we saw last summer, Brian, able to do reasonably well this summer, and building on the excellent work we've seen with the vaccinations. The challenge, as you rightly said, is on the international sector. And we do have, on an international basis, to see progress on the vaccination. If every country was as far ahead as Scotland and the rest of the UK and places like Israel, the situation would be different. But sadly, the risk of importing new strains of the virus is one that no responsible government can ignore. And I see just the news today, I think the Prime Minister has cancelled his visit to India. So we cannot ignore the risks. We have to be responsible. We have to have regard to safety. And I just make this final point. I do think that Scotland, because of our good vaccination, of our cautious policy, may have a competitive advantage in attracting people here in a few short months' time, I hope, from other parts of the world, simply because we are seen to have been a country that performed reasonably well in COVID, and that will give some visitors comfort, which they may not have in respect of other countries where the position is more checkered.
A question from John Murray. You mentioned in your manifesto the islands passport to encourage more people to visit the islands, promote seasonal visiting, etc., etc. John Murray saying fine and dandy for the islands, but what about the mainland Highlands, mainland North Highlands? He's talking about. He thinks that they get less in terms of infrastructure.
Well, we have increased our rural tourism infrastructure fund from 3 to 6 million, and that helps a lot of small projects, Brian, to address the issues of littering, of disposal of waste, of parking and camping facilities. We've done a huge amount of work with the public authorities. Visit Scotland, the STA, public bodies, Highland Council have done a power of work. We've given SNH, I think, a couple of million quid to employ more rangers. There are better facilities than last year, although I suspect that such will be the desire, the pent-up desire for people to enjoy a break in the Highlands that John is advocating, that we will still see pressure inevitably in some points. But I do predict a positive summer for mainland and island Scotland, provided we continue successfully to tackle the virus and implement the vaccination programme in the broadly efficient way that we have seen.
Final question, Fergus, a generic question. Do you accept that if we are to allow the industry to survive and then potentially thrive, that there has to be a competitive tax and financial and basically favourable tax regime for the industry in Scotland?
Yes, I do. I have for long felt that the industry has been overtaxed, and that was bearable when we were doing extremely well. This is a completely different situation. I think for the next several years, we will need, in Scotland and the UK, to recognise that the level of tax burden was not sustainable, and the reductions that we are seeing in business rates and VAT may indeed have to be sustained for much longer, Brian. Working with industry, we must get recovery, and there's a huge amount of work lying ahead of us. But thanks to the task force that I co-chaired, I do think we have some of the answers on the table, and we've got the appetite and the enthusiasm of the Scottish Government, and I think other parties, as we will shortly hear, to perform that task. Scotland is a great country for tourism. We've come on leaps and bounds over the past decades, and I think that we do have a positive future ahead of us if we can navigate the next few weeks and months.
Thank you very much indeed, Fergus Ewing for the SNP. Thanks very much for joining us, for putting your points and for answering the questions put to you. I'm going to move to our next speaker now. Fergus, thanks again. Our next speaker comes from the Scottish Conservatives. I'm delighted to welcome Jamie Halcro Johnston from the Scottish Conservatives, and I invite Jamie to put his points to the audience. We'll obviously be putting questions to him as well, and thanks again for the questions that are coming in. Let's invite Jamie Halcro Johnston to address us, please. Jamie.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks for the invite today. The last few years have seen a number of challenges to overcome for Scotland's tourism sector. Our relationship with the EU has changed, and we've coped with the impact of the pandemic. We've seen parts of our economy closed down entirely, a lack of clarity on reopening, and delays to business support. And I know from family and friends involved in the sector just how tough it's been. But I do believe the future of Scotland's tourism sector is a positive one, and that it will play, and it must play, a vital part in our economic recovery over the next few years. Our manifesto, which is being launched right at this moment, recognises that. We want to make Scotland the best place in the world to visit, but we appreciate that the sector is going to be more reliant on domestic visitors this year, and so we'll work with the sector to deliver a fresh campaign to market Scotland as a destination of choice for the rest of the UK. We want to see real investment in the infrastructure that supports our tourism sector, improving our road and rail network, delivering the ferries that are vital to get visitors to our island communities. But we also support greener travel, including delivering a national electric vehicle recharging infrastructure by 2025. And as we build back better, we do so as part of a green recovery, with the sector playing its part in our proposed circular economy bill. We'll deliver full fibre broadband for every household and business in our country by 2027, beginning in the areas left behind by R100. But we also don't want to increase burdens on businesses. And so we've dropped the current Scottish Government's one-size-fits-all approach to managing short-term lets, and we'll continue to oppose plans to introduce tourism taxes. But we also have to make sure the sector has the talent it needs, and as well as a £500 Retrain to Rebuild grant, with work to ensure more apprenticeships were initiated by businesses, ensuring they better reflect and meet the needs of sectors like tourism. And to support tourism businesses, we'll establish an economic development agency in every region, deliver community investment deals, and would offer at least 25% rates relief to leisure, hospitality and retail in 2022-23. The Scottish Conservatives will rebuild Scotland. Our focus, and the focus of all of us, must be on Scotland's recovery. That must be our priority, and working together, we'll make sure Scotland's tourism sector is a big part of that. Thank you.
Jamie, thank you very much indeed, and thanks for bringing us that information from the manifesto that's, as you say, just being currently launched. The big new idea, the 25% rates relief in 22-23. Do you feel? I mean, the economy, the state of the economy is dire. The state of the tourism economy is particularly dire. Is a quarter off your rates bill really going to make enough difference, or do you believe that the sector will be sufficiently recovered by 22-23 that is the level of support it will require?
Well, it's a very good point, Brian. Actually, what we've said is that that will be the initial look. We have to look and see where the economy is then. So it may well be that figure is greater depending on needs. So that is only the initial figure, and at least
could be more,
figure.
could be more, could be higher.
It could be more depending on where we are. And I mean, you know, if I was able to predict where the economy is going to be, then I would probably be doing a different job for a lot more pay. But you know, we recognise that there are huge challenges ahead, and we want to make sure that we have that flexibility, we have that ability to respond as the economy and sectors that are so reliant on it, you know, are able to.
Questions coming in on the rates revaluation due in 23. You've got a policy on that. You say you would undertake a wholesale review of the business rate system before the end of the Parliament, reference to the Barclay review that previously happened. You know, there are endless efforts to change the system of taxation locally, and they always seem to run into, you know, allegations of unfairness from one sector or the other. How radical would you intend to be with regard to non-domestic rates?
Well, I think one of the difficulties that happened with the Barclay review is that the Scottish Government wanted to make it revenue neutral, and that always meant that there was going to be a redistribution, and that would leave some businesses worse off. And what we saw was some businesses looking to be considerably worse off. What we want to make sure is that it's a fair review, that it looks at actually what's needed, what's required, and also what is fair. And I think that's very different to the approach that's been taken before, because I think there's a general understanding that the system does need to be looked at. But what it can't do is see businesses, particularly tourism businesses that have struggled, suddenly see their bills massively increase, and in some cases to the level that it simply wasn't sustainable. So we want to see a fair system put in place.
Let me pick you up on a couple of other things, Jamie, that come from your remarks and from others. I mean, your party is seeking to be in power at the Scottish parliamentary level, but you are, of course, in power at the UK parliamentary level. A question from Rebecca about international resumption of tourism to Scotland, something you mentioned yourself. The concern is that if there's too much foot dragging on this, either at the UK or the Scottish level, Scotland, and I quote, will unnecessarily lose out to other countries. The argument being it needs to be summer 2021 when this resumption begins. Is that feasible, and is that something you would back?
Yes, I think in some cases. I mean, I think what we have to be both careful of and also responsive to is that there will be countries where particularly that they have outbreaks of COVID or they have very high levels, and we obviously want to make sure that we are not in terms of importing a problem, as it were, in terms of COVID numbers. But
today the Prime Minister has cancelled a trip to India because of that very concern about the new variant there.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I mean, I don't actually just heard that, so so it's useful to know. But but you know, there are countries that have got very good low levels, as we do now, and I think we should be looking to try and get back to as far as normal as we can, because these are important visitors to our country that play an important role in our economy and as part of our economic recovery.
Let's talk about a couple of other questions that are just coming in. And again, many thanks to people for putting these in the chat room. One from Victoria Brooks. Businesses in the outdoor sector face unviable operations due to continued restrictions, looking for support to ensure it's not even thriving, it's survival is the word used in the question.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a problem all the way through the pandemic. There's been a number of areas, issues around lack of clarity, lack of support. There have been some, particularly in my Highlands and Islands region and the islands where I'm from Orkney, businesses that could legally open but practically couldn't because of restrictions allowed them. But the tourists weren't there. You're unlikely to use facilities or services in one part of Orkney in terms of accommodation. So there's a lot that needs to be done, and I think probably all parties agree, and it's certainly something that I've questioned Fergus Ewing on in the past. There's a need for support going forward. This is not, the support's not going to end in the next few weeks as the sector starts to slowly reopen. This is a sector that's going to need support kind of going forward, and we need to be clear on what that support is. I think there's been a general acceptance that certainly for some areas the support has been very slow to get to the businesses that need it.
Let me turn you to the question of short-term lets. I think you mentioned it yourself. You said you were against a transient visitor tax, and you had a position on short-term lets. Got a question from Callum Ross, Loch Melfort Hotel, talking about the short-term let order in Parliament. Fiona Campbell saying it's proved to be a contentious and difficult issue in the current Parliament. The question is asking about a balance between regulating amateur operators in urban areas and not penalising traditional B&B operators in rural areas. What's your take, Jamie, on short-term lets?
Yeah, we recognise that there is a difference between what's being proposed, or the impact of what's being proposed in the cities, and the need for some work in terms of dealing with we're talking about essentially a general term, Airbnbs, but of course that they are only kind of part of it. We recognise that there are issues within the cities and the central belt particularly, but obviously that what's happened is that the Scottish Government have come in with a licensing scheme that doesn't actually meet the requirements of Highlands and Islands and other rural parts of Scotland and other parts of Scotland kind of in general, where the pressure isn't the same. So what we want to do is make sure that we managed to get that delayed. We got that pushed back, and that was down to work in Parliament, but also a huge amount of effort by the sector and people like Fiona and others to get that delayed. But that's not off the table from the Scottish Government. So what we would you
accept that this is not necessarily primarily a partisan issue? It's an issue of trying to get it right collectively within Parliament.
Yeah, I would absolutely do that. I think some of the problem here has probably been a lack of understanding what the impact would be, and then maybe a bloody mindedness by some within government to just push forward with it. But thankfully, we've got to a stage that at least it's been pushed away. But we have to make sure that when it comes back, those problems that exist within the regulations are removed. Because, as I say, it just puts an extra burden on businesses that have been struggling, hugely already.
What about the generic state of the industry, if you like? I mean, do you believe, you talked earlier about working with the sector? Is there a collaborative effort? Could there be a 5-year recovery, an investment plan? Could that be a key stepping stone to getting the industry back, or do you need to do it piecemeal and deal with pragmatically with the individual problems as they arise?
No, I mean, I think the sector itself, and working with public agencies, has come forward with proposals and a vision essentially for the future. And I think, as we know, we don't know how the economy is going to necessarily respond. It's looking perhaps more positive than it could have been in general. And I think there's a huge demand for people to get out and about. I mean, get out of the cities, go on holiday, enjoy parts of our own country again. So I think there's a huge amount of encouragement there. But we know that it's going to need support. Now, part of that support will be responding to issues that may come up because of COVID or areas perhaps where parts of the economy haven't recovered as well as they would have done, we'd have hoped they'd done, and part of it will be making sure that there's that clear, that sustainable growth going forward, and you know, as part of a kind of wider plan, I think.
Another question from Frank Whitaker, a good one, talking really about the consequences of Brexit, the practical consequences of Brexit, saying that the sector, the tourism sector, has a very high reliance on EU citizens, many of whom, according to Frank, have returned home in the last 12 months. What about the need for an effective sector-focused in-migration system?
Yeah, well, this is obviously an area for the UK government, but it has been an area that, but it is an area that the UK government has responded, I think, well to in a number of different sectors. I mean, we've seen that with, for example, seasonal workers and others on and other kind of groups. I think there's probably two areas here. One, to make sure that that we have a system that allows people to come to this country to work, to come to this country to play a vital role in our economy, but also that we have the training in place, we have the education system and the apprenticeships, etc., in place to allow people within this country to train within it. And I think that's perhaps been an issue before. And that's not just also about having, you know, the right colleges and apprenticeships, but it's also making sure that tourism the sector is seen as a good industry to work in, a well-paid industry to work in, and one that people want to actually work in. So I think there's a number of areas there. Final
question, Jamie, and again, a rather generic one, but a very good generic question. We're looking for a strategic approach to the tourism sector, you know, making Scotland top of the league, world class in terms of 21st century tourism. What specific ideas and policies would you have that direct Scotland towards that, rather than perhaps just maybe rumbling along and dealing with the crisis as we currently have it? What can make that difference in terms of the policies that your party would advocate?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is actually it's about the sector itself, and you know, if we had a tourism sector that was that didn't have ideas and initiative and wasn't innovative in the way it ran itself, then government would have to play far more of a role than it does. I think the role of government is about providing the environment. It's support where it needs to be. It's providing that initial step up for perhaps small businesses, that funding to make sure that, you know, for example, agri-tourism is supported, or a planning system that allows hotels to be built, or whatever it happens to be. So government has an important role in it, but actually it's about making sure that government allows and supports the sector to come up with the approach that it needs to do. There are a number of areas.
But Jamie, is laissez-faire? I mean, I know you appreciate there's a role for government, but is laissez-faire good enough given the state of the industry and the frankly catastrophic crisis that it's faced in the past year or so?
Well, no, but I was going to move on to actually what we would do anyway to support.
Carry on.
But you know, there are a number of areas. I mean, for example, Highlands and Islands Enterprise plays a vital role within my region of supporting tourism businesses. But that's one sector, and the rest of, until recently, the rest of Scotland was covered by one agency. We want to have local agencies, which will therefore provide more support. As we provide more support and actually understands those areas a lot better, we recognise that that support in terms of finances, you know, the burdens on businesses are there at the moment. And that's why we're looking. Obviously, we've talked about rates relief. I've welcomed very much the VAT cut, you know, and the impact that's had. But as I say, it's making sure that we support that going forward. On a less kind of perhaps a less policy side, that you know, when we do give support, we give it out quickly. That we're clear on it. That we have regulations, or we have, when there are restrictions, as there have been, they have to be clear on what's being required, because a huge number of tourism businesses spent, you know, a lot of money preparing to be COVID safe, and then found that they were forced to close anyway. So we have to make sure that we're clear with the sector on issues like that going forward, and that we support the sector where the sectors aren't asking. And I dealt with huge numbers. I mean, I can't tell you the number of businesses that I was working with who were not sure exactly where the support was going to be coming from, not sure when it was going to hit their bank accounts, and they were wondering whether they would continue. And I will know that some of them will not still be working within the sector.
Jamie Halcro Johnston, thank you very much indeed for joining us at the Scottish Tourism Alliance Hustings. Thank you for taking the questions as well. Delighted that the questions were coming in live during your session there. Let me move on to our next speaker from the Labour Party, from Scottish Labour. I'm delighted to welcome Rhoda Grant. Rhoda, would you make your opening presentation, please?
Yes, thank you very much, Brian, and it's been a very interesting discussion thus far. Economy is really at the core of our policy for this election, both health recovery, of course, but also economic and social recovery. And Scottish Labour believes that tourism is crucial to this, not only for the jobs and the economic boost it provides, but also what it does for our well-being. And it's clear, as the other speakers have said, and I don't really need to tell this audience, that it has been disproportionately hit by the pandemic. A lot of my casework over the last year has been helping individual businesses to access funds to help them to stay afloat. And many of those businesses have been tourism businesses. And for one reason or another, they did not immediately all get help, and some indeed are still waiting. And it's the diversity of the industry that I think is its wonderful selling point, but that diversity has also proven challenging to the government when they're looking at distributing funds. And some businesses, as I've said, still have had none and are hoping that the council funding, the discretionary council funding, will actually provide some relief, but we all know that small amounts of money. Specifically for the tourism industry, the Scottish Labour Party will provide a third night free initiative, which would be government funded, a subsidy across accommodation in Scotland, whereby the government would pay for the third night of accommodation between September and November. And this helps boost tourist numbers, of course, but it also helps increase the tourist season, something that has always been a problem in Scotland. Our wider economic policy also works for the tourism industry as well. Initiatives such as providing £500 to unemployed or furloughed workers to provide them with new skills and put them in a better position re-entering the labour market. And we believe that the country must unite to build our economy, to encourage the staycation market at this point. And hopefully that will have a knock-on benefit when people experience the variety of breaks available much closer to home, and will continue coming back in years to come.
Rhoda, thank you very much indeed for your opening remarks. I think let's pick up right away on some of the policy announcements that you signalled there. The voucher scheme, this is a £75 prepaid card to every adult over 16 to spend in non-grocery businesses. So it could be hospitality, it could be leisure, it could be tourism. Do you see that working in practice, or do you see it perhaps being, potentially rather a bureaucratic system?
I see it working in practice. If we go back to the banking crash, which was a world global recession, Australia did this. They give people money on the understanding they didn't put it in the bank, they spent it. An exploding voucher, you spend it or you lose it. And Australia came under a huge amount of criticism because they didn't experience a crash. They actually managed to get people to go out and spend. Now, there is pent-up spending available. The divisions in Scotland have been really, focused on those who have very little or nothing have really suffered through the pandemic. But people who were able to work from home actually have saved a huge amount of money through this pandemic, and we need, I guess, to get them to put their hands in their pockets and spend some of that money, getting us all back on the road to recovery, because obviously people spend, create jobs, we create taxpayers, and that helps us out of the problems that have been caused by the pandemic.
But Audrey Ferry wants to some extent politicians to support the industry, but to get off the back with red tape and regulation, for example, in planning and licensing. Do you think there is too much bureaucratic red tape and frankly hindrance to the sector at the present moment?
I think we need regulation, to be honest. I would be lying to you if I said otherwise. I think it's the way it's done. Other speakers talked about the licensing scheme that was being proposed for self-catering and B&B. I mean, that was crazy, the way that was going to be implemented. And I would have to say, along with others, we spoke to the Scottish Government, and give them their due, they have shelved that to go back out to consultation. But it's that crazy kind of regulation that actually stops people doing what they're doing. But I suppose the pandemic has taught me as well that ways that you could easily identify those in the industry would be really helpful at this situation, because I have good going tourism businesses that I am dealing with day to day, just trying to find money to keep them afloat. And because they are not easily recognized, they don't get anything, and that's wrong too.
Let's turn to a couple of other issues that are raised. The idea of a transient visitor tax, so-called tourist tax, loads of questions on that. What's Labour's position on that?
We support that. We support it being devolved to local government, so it's up to local government how they use it. I mean, I live in the Highlands and Islands, and I would have to say every person I speak to is going on about potholes. We're on the NC 500, and where you're encouraging people to drive around a road that is really not fit for purpose. Now, some of that damage is caused by tourism traffic, but a lot of it is obviously caused by lack of investment.
Yes.
So we need to, if people are going to enjoy our areas, they need the infrastructure to allow them to do that. So it's impossible to invite people, but not actually ask them to help us maintain and upgrade the things that they're going to enjoy, because we need them to come back.
But at the end of the day, Rhoda, whatever your arguments are about the source of the problems in infrastructure, a transient visitor tax or a tourism tax is yet another imposition upon the industry, ultimately to be paid by the industry or paid by the customers of the industry. Colin Wilkinson from Scottish Licensed Trade Association says the industry already disproportionately contributes more than its fair share of the public purse. Why should they get another tax?
It's not a tax on the industry; it's a tax on the visitor. And
yes, but that's ultimately going to increase the cost of that visitor staying or going to an attraction or staying in a particular hotel rather, and that's ultimately going to increase the cost of the industry.
Yes, but I think one, if you are paying, and I've done this, I've gone to countries that charge that tax. It hasn't bothered me at all. I've been quite happy to pay it. It's a small proportion of what I would be paying overall. And if that means that we get a better offer for tourists that takes them back into our local areas, then I think that's money well spent.
And you mentioned another policy Labour have is what they call a summer staycation scheme. That's I think a third night free, capped at a level of £100. Tell me about that.
An autumn staycation.
Oh, autumn, forgive me, autumn.
So it's really going into those short.
I beg your pardon. September to November. It was billed to me as summer, but it's obviously late summer. Shall we be charitable? September to November, anyway. Yeah.
Well, let's hope we might get an Indian summer this year.
Indian summer.
That keeps people coming. But it is about extending that year, because we've had a year of winters for the tourism season, even worse than winters, to be honest, because people just haven't made any money. So when we can open up, and we need to do that carefully, because it's in nobody's interest to have a third closed down. But what we need to do is try and extend the time that people stay. Now, some of that can be done with very local people taking a short break. If we can extend that break from 2 to 3 nights, I think that makes a big difference to those businesses, because not only are people paying for their accommodation, they'll be paying for food, they'll be visiting attractions. So I think the knock-on benefit to trying to get people to stay a wee bit longer and get them to spend some of that money that they have saved up over the pandemic and to kickstart their businesses. And I think even out with the pandemic, we really have to work at trying to get tourism to as close as all year round as we can, because people talk about workforce, careers and the like. We need to make sure that we're offering people not seasonal work, but just long-term careers where they can build their skills and that they know they have a future there, so we don't lose the talent because of the seasonal nature of the work.
Okay, I'm going to jump back to forgive me mucking about a little bit, jump back to the transient visitor, the tourist levy, the tourist tax, whatever you call it. Loads of questions coming in on that, not exactly supportive. Another tax on Scots holidaying in Scotland. Scotland has to remain competitive is another point. We've got the highest tourism tax regime in Europe. Other competitor nations are lowering taxation upon the sector. What about these points?
I think there's issues around things like VAT people had talked about, but I think where the tourism tax is different from the national taxes of PAYE, VAT, that goes into the centre coffers. The tourism tax is on the tourist and it goes into local coffers. The councils that are providing, for instance, public toilets. I mean, it's a huge issue around Scotland, but certainly in the Highlands and Islands, public toilets are closed. That's a facility that is there, especially for tourists. And we need to have those facilities to make their experience, you know, good. They need to be able to access facilities that are fit for purpose.
What's your take on non-domestic rates? We've had loads of questions on those. Just add one in. John Martin from Poppy's Hotel voicing concern about business rates and about the valuation appeals system. What's your take on non-domestic rates and the prospect of being perhaps a substantial change to the system with a review?
We need a review. I think the other speakers have said that. So I think there is a consensus that we need a review of this. We would also go further that with that review, we would look at localizing the non-domestic rate system as well, handing that back to councils. I think we have seen in the last years of this current government centralisation all the time. Everything goes to Edinburgh, which frankly Edinburgh doesn't know it all and doesn't understand many parts of Scotland. If we empower local government to provide, not only to know what their industry can bear, but to provide the services their industries need, I think that would be really important. So not only just looking at the whole non-domestic rate system, but actually localising it, empowering local councils to charge it and to distribute it within their own communities, benefiting the very people that are paying it.
Would you hope that these local authorities would therefore might have the potential perhaps to compete by lowering those rates rather than having a competitive race to raise the highest level of cash for other services that they may feel necessary to supply?
Well, it's creating the right benefit for the communities. They obviously, I mean, councils are really concerned about economic development in their areas, so they will be aware, for example, of out-of-town retail versus our town centres. That's a big issue, and it's a big issue for tourism because, you know, the tourism industry sells our town centres. So we need to kind of make sure that balance is right, that we are not getting rid of people from the town centres to out of town shopping, so that the experience for the tourist and for the local person is much better. So I don't think it would be a race to the top or a race to the bottom. But I think it would depend on what the local area needed and what they could carry.
Final question, Rhoda, picking up from points in your own policy proposals. You talk about a mass outreach campaign advertising Scotland's natural beauty and historic heritage. Nobody, I think, would gainsay that. What is the advantage? What is the purpose, the point of doing that if there is a difficulty with staycations and there is pretty well a bar upon international inward vacations?
We need to capitalise on staycations, so we need to focus on the internal market to make sure those people who at the moment can't come abroad come to on holiday in their own country. But we need to be ready. We need to be ready when the market is opened up. And I'm not talking about taking any risks about, you know, having a flood of people and, you know, a third wave. So we have to be cautious, but we will be ready. And we need to be ready to encourage those people in when they come, because they too will be nervous about travelling. And we need to make sure that they know not only have we got a beautiful countryside to sell to them, we have a safe environment as well for them.
Rhoda Grant, thank you very much indeed for joining us on this Scottish Tourism Alliance Hustings. Thanks for your introductory remarks and thanks for taking those questions. I'm very grateful indeed. I'm going to move to our next speaker. Our next speaker is from the Scottish Green Party. I'm delighted to welcome Laura Moodie. Laura, would you give us your opening remarks, please? Laura.
Thanks, Brian. Building a fairer and greener Scotland as we recover from the COVID pandemic relies on investing in a green recovery that benefits all of us. The tourism industry in Scotland has been disproportionately impacted by the travel bans put in place to fight COVID-19. As the sector reopens and travel begins to resume, we must ensure tourism remains a point of pride for Scotland and that its work is sustainable and benefits local communities as well as businesses. We have less than 9 years left to tackle the climate crisis, and it looks increasingly unlikely that international tourism will ever return to how it operated pre-pandemic. However, domestic tourism has huge potential for expansion, and in Scotland, we're lucky to have an astoundingly beautiful countryside to explore and infrastructure that can be rapidly improved with the right investments to tackle both the climate crisis and the recovery from COVID. Our £895 million investment programme to restore nature includes £250 million for more and better national and regional parks, creating more than 1,000 new jobs. We're committed to increased funding for the core path network, and we'll work closely with countryside ranger services and access officers to address issues in honeypot areas that are really struggling to sustain current visitor levels. Our £22 billion 20-year plan for expanding and improving Scotland's railways has the potential to connect visitors to communities across Scotland. Free bus travel for under 22s starting this summer also opens up the country to our young people and families, as do our plans to provide free travel for children on ferries. By moving tourists from their cars to public transport, walking and cycling, we encourage them to spend more time and money locally and make Scotland more accessible, especially to young people. I very much doubt we'll return to the days of weekend mini breaks on budget airlines, but we can create attractive alternatives right here, right now. Eco and wildlife tourism is remarkably undeveloped in Scotland, as is agritourism. Let's encourage our visitors to linger, to savour Scotland, and to tread lightly, slowly and thoughtfully in our landscape.
Laura, thank you very much indeed for putting forward your perspective. I'm going to take some questions to bring some of the issues to the head. I looked through your manifesto on these aspects. I didn't see a specific reference to tourism. I stress, of course, that you were talking about public transport, you were talking about cycling, you're talking about ferries, etc., but you're not really specifically talking about tourism. Are you skeptical about the advantages of tourism, or simply anxious and worried about the footprint it can have, a damaging potentially footprint upon the environment?
I think the issue with tourism, especially in rural communities like the one I live in, is that it touches on every aspect. It's such a core sector for Scotland that I think it's very hard to just look at tourism in isolation without looking at issues, especially in terms of infrastructure, in terms of transport, in terms of the type of workforce we have and the employment opportunities that are available to them. So tourism is in the manifesto, but I don't think it's fair to sort of see it as an area just by itself, because I don't think tourism in Scotland will work and certainly won't thrive post-pandemic if we don't have investment in a whole range of areas that make those businesses more viable. What
is your take on international incoming visitors to Scotland, those flying here from America, flying here from Canada, flying here from the other countries in the European Union? Are you in effect saying to the tourism sector, forget that sort of incoming traffic is just not going to happen?
I don't think we're going to get a return to the pre-pandemic patterns of flying. I just don't think it is going to happen. That doesn't mean flying isn't going to happen. I know one of our policies is to introduce a sort of frequent flyer levy that's tapered, so everybody gets a tax-free, effectively, return trip every year. But beyond that sort of core nub of people that are travelling very frequently, one, I think they're unlikely to come back, but two, it's not sustainable for them to do so. So we need to set up a tax system that disincentivizes that kind of very frequent flying. But that doesn't necessarily hugely impact what happens within Scotland in terms of international visitors. Most international visitors to Scotland will want to stay for an extended period, will make it a big holiday event. And we're also looking at other ways to get people into Scotland. So over the weekend, we announced our plans to expand the ferry network and return a direct link to mainland Europe from Scotland, from the Scythe. So there are other ways that people can get here. But I think we are going to have to shift our thinking away from short trips or people coming up from London on bus trips and doing a quick one round Edinburgh, Skye, Loch Ness, and look at people coming for an extended stay to really get the full experience that Scotland has to offer.
I don't mean to be quizzical and overcritical, but if you're an American looking to come to play the Old Course in St Andrews, it's kind of hard to get a ferry.
Yeah, well, indeed. And those people might well come and stay for a lot longer. rather than just flying in for a weekend's golf and flying out, which, to be honest, unless you're the hotelier and the golf course owner, that impact is not terribly well spread within the economy. Whereas if someone is encouraged to come and fly and make it a long visit, they will travel around and visit several golf courses, perhaps Turnberry, not too far from me.
You would encourage Turnberry, gosh, given the owner. That very interesting. Yes, thank you. Not that I'm making any comment whatsoever upon the ownership of
I had
Turnberry.
a lovely day at the beach when Mr. Trump last visited.
Oh, yeah, I see. Yes, yes. But I mean, another point about this is you're talking really about relying, therefore, upon staycations or people coming from elsewhere in the UK. But business tourism coming to these islands is worth £2 billion. How would you replace that level of revenue with staycation holidays?
I think you can do a lot, and I think Scotland hasn't really tapped into that internal potential as much as it potentially could have. So when we've talked about expanding railways and expanding free bus travel, that gets people into rural communities, and crucially, instead of their money being spent on the big airlines to get them there, or being spent on the bus companies to get them there, that's money they've got in their pocket to spend in their local community. When I was in my late teens, before I went off to university, I did that whole backpacking around Europe thing. Sadly, due to Brexit, that's less of an option for our young people now. But with free bus travel for under 22s, they can get their backpack, they can get on the bus, and they can go and travel around their own country and explore Scotland. And there's a huge amount to explore.
Rebecca, pretty sceptical about your view, says it would need an extra 8 million domestic visitors to compensate for no international spend.
Yeah, well, we're not talking about no international spend. As I've said repeatedly, people will still be able to fly here, but we're not going to have those people coming for a weekend and flying straight back out again. I just think it's not going to happen realistically post-COVID, to be frank. But even if it was, we can't sustain that. Our environment can't sustain that.
What about the support, the generic idea of moving to zero carbon, net zero carbon? How would you offer support to tourism businesses in their transition to that? It's a question of Barry McCulloch.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the last budget, we secured a £10 million nature restoration funds that businesses can apply to, and a £5 million adaptation fund for farmers to adapt to climate friendly farming practices. We'd really like to see support like that rolled out across industries to support businesses to develop more sustainable systems. There are some really great examples of low impact tourism in Scotland, and I think it's an area that there could be a lot of growth in. But indeed, you do need to spend money to enable that. And so that would likely come in the form of a grant scheme that people could apply to.
Just a couple of issues that have been raised with other speakers as well. The transient visitor levy, the tourism tax, call it what you will. What's your take on that? Do you support that idea?
Yeah, we agree, obviously, that a tourist tax should be temporarily delayed. That's not something we want to bring in imminently post-COVID, but we still believe it's a necessary form of taxation, and it will deliver benefits for local communities because it can be reinvested in infrastructure and tourism, and really support communities to thrive. Obviously, the tourism tax is creating a lot of anxiety just now for small business owners. So I think it's really important that when we design and implement that happens in consultation with local residents and businesses owners, especially post-COVID. But I think, unlike the other parties, we're the only party that are really proposing a pretty wholesale radical transformation of all of our forms of taxation. And for us, tourist tax is just a part of a wider range of tax that we'd like to see that will be more locally controlled and variable. So in some regions, a tourist tax might not be appropriate. A workplace parking levy might be or might not be, but we want to give local government more power to raise their own funds in a way that's appropriate to their community.
What would you do with non-domestic rates, with business rates?
Again, for a long time, we've campaigned to get business rates set at a local level and by local councils, and that the revenue comes directly to them rather than the current situation where it's chiefly set in Westminster. So we'd really like to have a look at that. When COVID hit, we released a list of key asks to government, one of which included asking for an increased support for small businesses affected by the virus and a business rates freeze. So we know business rates for tourism needs a lot of reform. We'll listen to concerns from people in the tourism industry about that. But really, I think it's about a wholesale reform, both of the taxation itself, but also where that revenue goes to.
hearing skepticism, or reading skepticism in the chat room. And I know your answer to this will be improved public transport. But Caroline Miller says public transport almost non-existent in many rural areas. Most rural areas accessed by cars. How do you increase rural tourism without using cars? She says she lives 2 miles from a city boundary in rural Angus. My guess is that means she's very close to the cradle of civilization. But anyway, despite that proximity to the cradle of civilization, she's not very happy about the basic point is how do you get to the tourism to be sustained, while you wait umpteen years to boost the public transport.
Well, you don't wait umpteen years. We're proposing investment in public transport now. In the longer term, taxation levies can go into that, but we're saying we borrow now, we invest now in the green recovery we need to see. We don't wait for that to happen. So we proposed a 20-year, £22 billion rail expansion programme, and that would bring railway across Scotland where people already have railway. It will increase electrification, improve and dual some of the lines. Where you don't, you'll either be considered for rail or an integrated coach service that will get you back onto the railways quickly. So that's vital. But buses are going to be essential in rural areas. I live 2.5 miles from my nearest village, let alone any more substantial public transport from that. We need to make sure that as well as integrating buses to trains, we integrate walking, active travel, cycling to those buses so people can take their bikes on the bus and then on the train, or people can walk safely to their nearest bus stop. So, I mean, really our infrastructure for public transport has been vastly underinvested in for a long time. And I agree, it's atrocious in most of rural Scotland, like the part of rural Scotland I live. The UN think it's an issue in terms of extreme poverty. It should be dealt with like a utility service. So it needs to be back in public ownership and it needs investment.
To be fair, as you say, you're getting comments online as well saying, agreeing with your argument that investment in greener ways of travel is the future. And Caroline Miller helpfully confirming that she's talking about living 2 miles from the great and noble city of Dundee, which is useful. Laura, I'm going to draw to a close, but ask you to make a comment on perhaps the idea of business tourism again, international business tourism for city centres. That's a big market in Scotland that maybe isn't covered by your stress upon green transport options.
I think that's going to be a really challenging area. In my day job, I work for an organisation called Mid-Steeple Quarter, and that's a community benefit society that's buying back the centre of Dumfries High Street, the abandoned properties, and redeveloping them to what the community wants, which is a mix of housing, enterprise, retail. We've kind of been slightly ahead of the curve because a lot of towns post-COVID are now looking at what we're doing in Dumfries and thinking, actually, we need to do something similar. I think we're going to have to go through the same sort of process in terms of conference centres and international business travel.
Well, the example being used in this question from Marshall Dallas is about the EICC, Edinburgh International Conference Centre, the argument being that, like the SEC, the AICC and others, providing over 1 million room nights to city centre hotels. That's going to be jolly hard to make that up with cyclists and folk coming by the ferries.
Indeed, but I mean, we're going to have to tackle it because international travel is not going to come back. It isn't. My husband recently changed jobs. He got headhunted in the middle of the pandemic, and the place he's working for is multinational, but they have stopped travel and they're not going to go back. They've seen the light. They can't justify it in terms of climate. They can't justify it financially anymore because they've spent a year doing everything remotely, and why go back? So it's about looking at those buildings and saying, well, okay, what can these be repurposed for? Do we need co-working hubs that people come into? Do we need meeting spaces that people can hire? So, if they're mostly working from their bedroom, they're not there when they're meeting clients. Can these be used for enterprise, for retail? Can they be used for creative spaces, for artists and makers? We are going to have to reimagine what those buildings are for, and we are going to have to redevelop what our economy is built on. But I'm not going to stand here and say those business travellers are going to magically come back. That's not going to happen. So we need to look ahead and think about a new way of using those buildings, a new way of getting people to fill those hotel rooms.
Laura Moodie, thank you very much indeed for joining me. Thanks for taking the questions, and thanks indeed for your opening remarks as well. Laura Moodie from the Scottish Greens. Thanks again. I'm going to move to our final speaker in this Scottish Tourism Alliance Hustings. Delighted to welcome from the Scottish Liberal Democrats, Liam McArthur. Liam, would you give us your opening remarks, please?
Thanks very much, Brian, and thanks to Mark and the STA for hosting this hustings. Avid election watchers will not be surprised to hear me confirm that Scottish Liberal Democrats are determined to put recovery first. The pandemic has cost lives, disrupted learning and deepened a pre-existing mental health crisis. Businesses are struggling to survive long enough to rebuild, and people are worried about what the future holds when furlough ends. That's why the next 5 years needs to see a relentless focus on recovery. And Scottish Liberal Democrats recognise that there can be no national recovery without a recovery in tourism. This is a sector, as I know from representing Orkney over the last 14 years, that contributes to hundreds of thousands of jobs and communities across every part of Scotland and ties in so many other sectors as well. It's a sector that's borne the brunt of the pandemic, yet many businesses were ineligible for schemes or waited months for the support they desperately needed. As restrictions start to ease, so attention must turn to rebuilding, including addressing the impacts of Brexit and a climate emergency. I'm confident our tourism sector has a bright future with the assets, the reputation and the innovation to succeed. So how can this recovery be supported? Well, ongoing assistance with cash flow will be required along with other targeted support. We want to see a tax break, for example, for high street shops to help them compete with online. We'll give tourism in Scotland the digital and transport infrastructure it needs to thrive. And we'll start a programme of capital works in tourist areas to provide better car parking, charging points and signage to manage tourist numbers better. Create and publicise a network of public toilets with waste and rubbish disposal points across Scotland. And we shouldn't repeat the mistakes of Brexit with independence. Scotland needs stability and businesses need time and space to reconfigure and rebuild. That's something Scottish Liberal Democrats are ready to offer with a clear plan to put recovery first. And I look forward to taking your questions, Brian.
Liam, thank you very much indeed. Piles of questions, new questions coming in as well, and piles of questions already in existence. You mentioned infrastructure there, infrastructure investment. Callum Ross from Loch Melford Attell looking for critical projects. The example he gives is the A83 Rest and Be Thankful to be completed in the life cycle of the next Parliament. Do you give stress upon that sort of infrastructure? I mean, I hear you mentioning, you know, the other elements of capital works. Would you also give stress upon these sort of projects, road projects that, you know, perhaps would be frowned upon by some other parties?
Well, I think you draw a distinction between, I suppose, additional infrastructure. We should be building more and new roads. We should be maintaining the network we have. I mean, I think the Rest and Be Thankful is almost quoted on a monthly basis in Parliament as ministers announce the latest closure. I mean, there certainly needs to be action taken to address that issue. It's a key route for the communities that rely upon it, not just for tourism, but for those that live and work there and need to go about their daily lives. But I mentioned there digital infrastructure, for example. And we were promised broadband to 100% of households and businesses across the country by 2021. The minister even offered to resign were that not delivered. Well, it hasn't been, and he hasn't. And yet we're seeing this as absolutely crucial. I mean, the digital divide exposed by the pandemic was utterly brutal, not just for those working at home, but those studying at home, those accessing services. This isn't just a nice to have, this is an absolutely need to have. And it's key for the tourism sector in so many different ways. So we need to see that delivered as a matter of absolute urgency.
Let's talk about, there's 100 issues have arisen during these discussions. Let's talk first of all about international inward tourism. You know, people coming here from America, Europe, Canada, Australia, etc. Do you believe, as our previous speaker said, that the days of that are coming towards a close? She was not closing it down, let's be clear about that. But do you believe that we, or is there still a degree of reliance upon that in Scotland?
I think there will continue to be a reliance upon it. I think it's also fair to say that behaviours will inevitably change. They've changed as a result of the pandemic, and the notion that we'll simply go back to the status quo ante is I think unrealistic for a whole variety of reasons. I think the issue of international travel in terms of the contribution that aviation makes to climate change it may not be amongst the highest contributors, but it will need to play its part in terms of the fight we've got to reduce emissions. So I think for those reasons, we're going to see international travel look very differently going forward. But I think Scotland is well placed in terms of the offering it's able to make, the experience it's able to give, that people will be prepared to prioritise that over other destinations that may be closer to hand and maybe even less expensive. And that's certainly the part of the market we need to be pitching for.
Let me pick you up on another couple of points. Colin Wilkinson from the Scottish Licensed Trade Association talking about the rules that are currently, I think he would say afflicting the industry in terms of distancing and constraints and all of these. Have they been too tight in Scotland? Have they been liberalised too slowly, or do you believe that caution has been necessary?
I don't necessarily have a difficulty with taking a more cautious approach. I think there's a difficulty, or you run a risk of perhaps opening up too quickly and then finding you have to close things down again, and that opening, shutting is almost more damaging still. I think where one of the problems has arisen is almost the inconsistency, or the apparent inconsistency between the way in which certain regulations bite on certain activities but not on others. I mean, I know in Orkney, for example, for some time now, we've been in level 3, which meant you've been able to kind of book a badminton court as a member of the community, but school children in the local schools, because they're under the national restrictions affecting education, haven't been able to have that same ability for those undertaking PE. So the inconsistencies in the way that the regulations have been applied, I think I've thrown up, and I've been watching the chat function there, I've thrown up any number of anomalies that are very difficult to reconcile with a sort of logical easing of the restrictions and allowing business to getting back to doing what they do best.
One anomaly raised by Bridgeen Mullen from the Clydeside Distillery says, why is the 2 metre rule still in place for visitor attractions and not changed to 1 metre in line with the hospitality sector? Have you got sympathy with that argument?
Again, look, Brian, I remember making the argument back in the summer last year when restrictions were opening up at the start of July, that we had not just visitors, we had locals coming into Orkney on Loganair flights, sat next to each other or behind or in front of each other, but on the ferries there still needed to be a 2 metre distance, which reduced the capacity, in a sense, weren't allowing terribly many people to travel. I think it's anomalies like that people find it very difficult to get their heads around. It has an impact in terms of compliance, and it I think undermines to some extent public confidence in the rationale for the rules. So I can certainly understand the misgivings, the disquiet that there is within the sector at some of those anomalies that's are being identified there.
Liam, you mentioned islands earlier. I understand why, obviously, but Rob McKinnon from the Outer Hebrides Tourism, I'll sum up the question a little bit. It's about the provision of ferries to the CalMac network, the concern being that it's lagging behind the requirements and needs.
Look, you won't find me disagreeing with that.
I'm sure not.
I think one of the real problems is that we haven't had a ferry replacement strategy worth the name. We've obviously seen the controversy around the building of the 2 ferries at Ferguson's, which are now years behind schedule and already twice the original budget. These are the lifeline. We need modern ferries that are fuel efficient but are still fit for the purpose they need to perform in the island communities I represent. The ferries operating those routes are well past their sell-by date. So not only is there an environmental impact in terms of the emissions and the fuel costs, but you've got unplanned maintenance that are taking these ferries off the routes. I know that there are similar issues within the CalMac network as well. So this is an issue for tourism, absolutely, undoubtedly, but it's an issue for the communities that rely upon them and for whom these are the absolute lifeline.
Liam, what's your take? Again, just going through a whole pile of issues that are salient and germane to this sector, one that's been discussed with others, but I'll ask your party's position on this, the controversy over short-term let regulation.
Yeah, I've had quite a bit of engagement with this, and I know Fiona Campbell's involved in today's meeting as well. She's been extremely helpful in highlighting the concerns of the self-catering sector. Yes. On this. And obviously the government at the last minute decided to withdraw the regulations. I think they were ill-conceived or ill-drafted at very least. And I think partly
you welcome the withdrawal of them.
Absolutely welcome the withdrawal, no doubt about it. The threat that they are likely to be brought back before the summer recess is one that I think would temper that welcome. I think there is a need to spend some time in trying to identify what it is that we're trying to address here. Because on the one hand, we were told it was about improving kind of health and safety amongst accommodation providers, health and safety that is governed by a range of other regulations that are already in place. On the other hand, we were told it was about ensuring that there was the availability of housing stock for rent within certain communities. So we need to be clear what the purpose of this is before we can identify then how best to draft the regulations to give effect to that. And it seemed to me that these were regulations that went well beyond their original brief. So I think before they're brought back, there needs to be a cold hard look at what we're trying to do here. Is it an issue of health and safety, which I very much think it's not, because the regulations are already in place? Who are we trying to target with it? Is it about the kind of the element of the Airbnb sectors, which are not about professional businesses and that's their core business? This is a bit of a kind of sideline, in which case we need to draft them very, very differently from the way they were drafted previously.
What do you think about the issues affecting the hospitality sector? We talked about the distancing. We got a question in on the nighttime economy in hospitality, which according to our question, Audrey Ferry, seems a long way from opening. I mean, how that sector, that element of tourism, hospitality, restaurants, pubs, nightclubs, etc., really has been struggling. Is there any prospect of them getting back to any form of economic health soon?
Well, I mean, I think not just that, Brian, but I was listening in earlier on, and I think it might have been Jamie that referred to the work that many of those businesses did in order to make themselves compliant, only to find that the rules shifted and all the work and investment they put in accounted for naught. And I think that, as much as anything else, needs to be resolved. I think it will still need to be a gradual opening, but the restrictions themselves need to have a consistency about them, and we need to avoid creating perverse incentives and disincentives for behaviour that is every bit, if not more, risky in terms of the spread of the virus than is the behaviour within a more controlled environment that hospitality is able to provide. I mean, there's undoubtedly those within the hospitality sector who were sailing a bit close to the wind and not necessarily taking the steps they might have. But I have to say that the bulk of those that I've engaged in have shown huge ingenuity in terms of the way that they've reshaped their businesses and how they deliver for customers, and I think they're to be hugely commended for it.
Couple of final questions, Liam. Non-domestic rates, something that's been discussed substantially throughout this hustings. What's your party's take on business rates, non-domestic rates, particularly with that revaluation potentially coming up?
Well, I think the problem we've had with revaluations is that there's been an absolute cliff edge. There's not been a tapering in recent revaluations, which seems to me, if you're a winner, you may be counting your blessings. But if you're revalued and you see your bills going up fairly significantly and all in a winner, it doesn't matter if you're a good going, viable, profitable business. It completely upends your financial calculations. So I think tapering to any new system would need to be required. I want to see this done more locally. We've been arguing this for some time. This needs to be something that local authorities are able to get their hands around more and work in ways that are more in keeping with the business base within their communities. I think the other thing to say is that again, the pandemic has disrupted in a way that is almost unimaginable. Businesses are operating very differently from the way they did before, and therefore we're going to have to look at the way business taxation is structured. I mean, with home working obviously drives a bit of a coach and horses through the notion that everybody turns up to a place of work that is then taxed accordingly. So I think this is an area ripe for fairly radical reform.
The final take, the industry, the sector generally, the hospitality sector, the tourism sector, the outdoor sector generally has been struggling very severely. If you were offering one big idea that could help them, well, it's more survive than and ultimately thrive, from your perspective, what would that be?
Well, as I said, I think originally, we need to make sure that as the restrictions ease, we don't simply think that that's game done. I think there's ongoing support that be required, and I think it probably needs to be more tailored and nuanced, because I think different businesses in different parts of the country are going to require different remedies, are going to require different types of support. So therefore, I think rather than the big bang schemes that we've seen, where lots of businesses have found themselves out in the cold for months before they manage to wangle their way in, that needs to change. We need to have that consistency of support. But for me, frankly, until we have a digital infrastructure in this country that is fit for the 21st century, I think we don't have a prayer in positioning Scotland in tourism, but in so many other economic sectors as a forward-looking nation, and we need to get that sorted as quickly as possible.
Liam, thank you very much indeed. I'll let you get back to your badminton if that's the objective. I'm sure you may
clearly never seen me play, Brian.
might not have much time for badminton. Liam McArthur from Scottish Liberal Democrats, thank you very much indeed for your presentation. Thanks for taking the questions. And that's the coming to the close of the Scottish Tourism Alliance Hustings. Can I thank all of the participants today who have taken the questions. A huge vote of thanks from me, for all those who put forward questions, both in advance, but particularly in the chat room as well. And I see that the chat room is still live, bouncing along in lively fashion. My thanks for that, and my thanks as well to the Scottish Tourism Alliance for organising this event. From me, Brian Taylor, Toodaloo the New, and I hand over to McArthur.
Thank you, Brian, first and foremost, for chairing that session absolutely superbly. Great to have such professional doing it and really teasing out the answers to the questions posed. And of course, thank you to all the panelists, politicians who've given up their time to take part. What it is good to hear that from everybody, there is an absolute recognition of just how important tourism is to Scotland's economy. And it's great to have such a much more lively and outward conversation about the importance of the recovery of the sector. We have a vision for Scotland to be the world leader in 21st century tourism by 2030. That's very much our aim and ambition, but it requires every political party to support the industry as best as they possibly can and make that commitment as well to working with us too. So there's lots of questions in the chat. There's of course differing views and differing opinions, but we are a committed and driven sector that is determined to succeed. But we do need, in the short term, a lot more to help that rescue, and then some real accelerated positive policy and investments to drive our recovery, and so that we can continue to be the destination that everybody wants to visit and can do so in a very deliver that in a very competitive way. So thank you again to everybody. Thank you to Charlotte Street Partners as well, who've helped us bring this event together, and also to Lux Events, who've hosted the platform. And on that note, as I say, this program will be, the link to it will be published tomorrow, so you can wind back and listen again to what people have said. But appreciate your time and support as always. And again, Brian, thank you very much. It's you and I can enjoy the delights of Costa del Bearsden this afternoon, because the sun is shining outside my window. All the best. Thank you.